Hey there guys, how's it going? Welcome back to my fantasy fight series. So, I've got a bit of a bizarre one to do today. One that don't even bother asking me why I thought to do this, but I don't know, for whatever reason, I was just sitting about one day, just looking at just looking at some fight videos on YouTube, looking at some highlights and stuff. I was really bored. I had nothing to do, and all of a sudden, something just hit me. It just came right to me, and that was who would win in a fight between Nikolai Valuev and Deontay Wilder. I don't know why that fight came into my head. I have absolutely no idea, but for whatever reason, I thought, you know what? I'm doing fantasy fights. This would be a fun one to talk about. So how would this fight go? Deontay Wilder against Nikolai Valuev. And then when I started thinking about this fight, and when I started thinking about all the fights of these guys who I've watched, and just how this fight would work, like the dynamics of it and everything, I actually found out this is actually a pretty fascinating one to talk about, and it's actually really interesting. And this is a fight that, had it happened, if these two guys fought at their prime, I genuinely think this would be a fascinating fight. I really do. So let's talk about it. So both of these guys, interestingly enough, actually have a lot in common. Deontay Wilder and Nikolai Valuev. First of all, obviously they were both heavyweight champion. They both have pretty much padded records. If you look at both of their records, they have very impressive looking records on paper. Lots of wins, lots of knockouts. However, they both have, like I mentioned, extremely padded records. The vast majority of fighters they fought were journeymen. The vast majority of fighters they fought were physically a lot weaker and a lot smaller. And yeah, if you just look at their resumes in comparison and take into consideration that they were both world champions, just the way that they were both brought along and the type of opposition that they fought on their way to becoming champion, on their way up, and even some of their title defenses, and the type of level of competition and opponents in regards to physical advantages and just the type of opponents that they fought to become champion and to defend the title. Both of these guys actually are quite similar resume wise. Now, that's pretty much where the similarities end, and these two, in terms of their physical attributes and as well as their fighting style, are completely different. They're a complete contrast to one another. So, Deontay Wilder, you all know Deontay Wilder and what he's like. He's a tall, slim, on the lighter side of the heavyweight division, only a few pounds above the cruiserweight limit when he's in the best of shape. He's a guy who is very lanky. He's got quite fast hands for a heavyweight. That's one thing that you can credit Deontay Wilder is he is quite quick. However, he's a one-trick pony. The only strategy that he has going into any fight is to land the straight right hand, because the straight right hand is a shot that he's been basically blessed with. It's a shot that he has basically mastered. He gets just the perfect amount of leverage and speed behind that straight right hand. So if he lands that straight right hand, and if he lands it in a well placed position, and if he lands it with just the right amount of pressure and speed, he can knock anybody out. Any heavyweight in the world. If he catches them at the right moment with that straight right hand, he could be very devastating with it, is what I'm saying. So yeah, he's basically, like I said, he's a one-trick pony. Okay, but that's all he has is that straight right hand. If he can't land that straight right hand, his temperament goes completely out the window. His strategy of landing it goes out the window, and he gets very emotional and starts swinging, starts slugging, throws himself off balance, throws himself onto his opponent's punches, and as we've seen from Deontay Wilder and how his career ended up, and I consider his career pretty much over. I don't think his career will go on much longer now. And as we saw how it ended up, he ended up being completely dismantled towards the end by Tyson Fury, who was just a bigger, better, more skilled, more athletic, more technically efficient, and more intelligent fighter. A guy who was just had more than one trick, if you know what I mean. He was more than a one-trick pony. He was a fighter who had just so much more skill and so much better technique than what Wilder had, and Wilder just couldn't compete. I mean, he got completely taken apart, and I mean, it really just goes to show you how terrible the competition that Deontay Wilder had been fighting was. I mean, fighting bums like Luis Ortiz and Bermane Stiverne and all those other guys he fought before that, just journeymen basically, a bunch of fat midgets and journeymen. And Deontay Wilder, I think to sum Deontay Wilder up as a fighter, he's a tall guy, a skinny guy with no defense, no brains, no technique, decent hand speed, and a very powerful straight right hand. And pretty decent stamina. That's one thing I will say about Wilder. He had pretty good stamina for a heavyweight. He could throw punches for 12 rounds, and he would, while he's slugging and wasting energy, he can waste a lot of energy and he can still land a knockout punch late in fights. Although I do question the legitimacy of a lot of Wilder's knockouts, if I'm being honest. I think a lot of his fights were fixed. I've talked about that in the past, but whatever, I digress. So, Nikolai Valuev, I mentioned he has a lot in common with Wilder. He does. He was a fighter who was tremendously limited. All right, very, very limited fighter. Technically, athletically, he just didn't really have a lot. However, he had a fantastic record. And that record and knockout percentage and everything was all due to, obviously part of it was due to physical advantages, but the vast majority of it was due to the opposition he fought. I believe he had like 50 wins, only 2 defeats, and 34 knockouts, something like that. And he had those knockouts generally were at more of a lower level when he was fighting journeyman, just like Wilder. When he was fighting journeyman, he was knocking them out in the first and second round and all that. But when he increased his competition and when he fought guys who had more experience and skill, he tended to either go the distance or he would stop them on an accumulation in the later rounds. Very similar to Wilder. Valuev wasn't really a big puncher, judging by a guy his size. Obviously, he could punch. I mean, the dude was 7'2", 200, 400 plus pounds. The guy was massive. He was a huge guy, so obviously he could punch. He could knock you out if he landed a shot, but he could punch. If you were to compare his power on a pound for pound scale, he doesn't punch very hard for a guy that size. Like, for example, if a guy like David Haye, for example, and I use him as an example because he fought Valuev. If David Haye was the same size as Valuev, or if Deontay Wilder was the same size as Valuev, they would punch like absolute monsters, by comparison. So Valuev, even for a guy that big, technically speaking, on the grand scale of things, he wasn't that big a puncher. And his knockouts, when he increased his opposition, tended to be of the accumulation variety, where he would just break these guys down and lean on them and just, outwork them on attrition and eventually break them in the later rounds. A good example of that would be when he fought Monty Barrett. That was a really good fight, actually. If you guys haven't seen that fight, go and check it out. It was fun. And he was, like I said, a big guy, slow as molasses. He was unbelievably slow. He had very little fighting spirit and energy. He was a guy who was very patient in the ring. He would just wait and he would wait and he would wait. And eventually, by being so big and so imposing, he would eventually land something. And he would eventually manage to corner you and break you down and knock you out. However, Valuev had one thing that made him superior to most of the guys he fought. And it was something that was a major problem. This is what made him a major problem in the heavyweight division and why, in my opinion, he was able to go so far and able to achieve as much as he did. Valuev had an incredible, and guys, I'm not exaggerating, he had an incredible chin. That guy was tough as nails. Like I said, go and watch some of his fights, like his fight against Monty Barrett, for example. Monty Barrett was... I remember that fight, like Monty Barrett was swinging for the fences, was landing haymaker after haymaker, and Valuev was just laughing them off, like punches that landed on his big giant head and just bounced off like it was like hitting a brick wall. In fact, I think David Haye actually described fighting Nikolai Valuev and hitting him as like hitting a brick wall. That's how he described it, because he was just so tough and so physically durable that you could hit him with your best punch and it would hurt your hand. Like, the dude was incredibly tough. He had an incredible chin. And he was never once stopped and he was never once dropped in over 50 fights. I think he had like 52 pro fights. Never dropped. And the only two guys that beat Valuev, and that's one of the things I find interesting about it, the only two guys that beat him were small cruiserweight type fighters. The two guys who beat him, so you had Ruslan Chagayev, who was only 5'11", who was very, very small, like a very small, out of shape, not very physically imposing southpaw, who was very ordinary looking, a bit of a plodder. However, he had great defense. That's one of the things about Chagayev that made him so difficult to deal with, is he knew how to fight small, and even though he was short and stocky, he had that sort of same ability that a fighter like Mike Tyson has, in the sense that when he's fighting small, I'm not comparing him to Mike Tyson. He was a completely different style, but in the sense that he's able to duck at the waist and bob and weave a little bit, and he also had his guard up very tight, and he was just so hard to hit. Like, fighters would be punching down and trying to hit Chagayev, and he would just get on the inside, and he would sort of make them overextend themselves and outwork them inside. He would hit them with hooks and uppercuts in close, and he was able to get low and fight small and completely outbox Nikolai Valuev, and he outworked and outboxed Valuev and beat him by a majority decision. And the other guy who beat Valuev, of course, was David Haye, another small cruiserweight-sized fighter who moved up in weight. And the way that David Haye beat Valuev was very, very different to how Chagayev did. However, the result of the fight was the same. It was a majority decision. So it was pretty much the same outcome. David Haye won the fight by hitting and running, basically, by pot-shotting. He would land a shot, run away, let Valuev chase him and tire himself out. Then he'd jump in with another shot, run away. And it was basically a bit of a stinker, a bit of a boring fight. And David Haye sort of just nicked the victory away from Valuev. He nicked it away by just pot-shotting and landing the odd shot here and there to make it look like he was winning. And it was that type of fight. It was a very boring and very technical fight, on a level of, putting you to sleep. It was like a cure for insomnia, that fight, man. David Haye just outwitted Valuev, is what I'm saying. Pot-shotted and ran and hit and ran his way to victory, and that's how he won. And my point is, Valuev was never beaten, in the sense that he was never destroyed in the ring. Like, he was never beaten up. He was never dominated. The two guys who beat him did so by being cerebral and by using their speed and lack of size to their advantage. And it was quite smart. Like, it's quite smart how both of them managed to beat Valuev, because he was so much bigger than both of them. I mean, he was over a foot taller than Chagayev, and he was like nearly a foot taller than David Haye. So he was huge compared to those guys, and the fact that they were able to just use their lack of size and their speed to their advantage was quite impressive to some extent, and it showed the type of strategy that you'd need to employ to defeat such a big guy, to somebody who was not only big but incredibly tough. Now, the reason I bring all that up, the reason I just went on that whole tangent, is because would Deontay Wilder be able to implement that strategy? Think about it. The way that David Haye fights, David Haye's a smart guy. David Haye's a fighter who, when he is in survival mode, he's very good at being one side of the ring and then jumping in with a punch and then getting back out with his footwork. Very quick on his feet with very quick hands. Now, Deontay Wilder has quick hands, but Deontay Wilder doesn't particularly have quick feet. He doesn't have great balance. If he were to try and fight that way against Valuev, he would jump in. He would probably fall off balance and have himself standing right in front of this big 7'2" giant, and would need to find a way to keep him off. So the question is, with Deontay Wilder being a one-punch knockout artist, like a one-trick pony who's just there to land the right hand, just there to knock you out with the straight right hand, would he be able to knock out Nikolai Valuev with that straight right hand? Because Nikolai Valuev is considerably taller. I mean, Wilder's 6'7", so Valuev is several inches taller. He's 7'2", so Wilder would be punching up. And we saw against Tyson Fury, and Tyson Fury's only, I say only, I mean, he's massive. He's 6'9", but by Valuev's standard, that isn't very tall. So punching up to hit Tyson Fury, we saw that he was able to just take a step back, and he was able to parry Wilder's right hand away. And I'm not saying that Valuev would be able to do that, because Valuev was slow as molasses and didn't have very great defense. But Valuev was able to compensate for that by having what Tyson Fury doesn't have, and that's a granite chin. Because Tyson Fury doesn't have a great chin. He doesn't really take a shot well. That's why he's had to rely on his defense and he's had to rely on his movements. But Valuev could take the right hand. I assume since Wilder's punching up and he's trying to target that big head that's high above him, I think it would be difficult for Wilder to generate power. I don't think he'd be able to generate the power that he's able to generate against someone like Brazil, who's the same height as him, or someone like Chris Arreola, who's shorter than him. I think that if he was to punch up against somebody like Valuev, he would find himself in a situation where his power is a little bit lesser, where his power isn't as effective as it usually would be. And that interests me. Now, it's a fight that I'm going over in my head, and like I said, this is a fascinating one, because if Deontay Wilder couldn't knock Nikolai Valuev out, presumably he would have to win the fight on points, right? Would Deontay Wilder be able to outbox Nikolai Valuev? Would he? And it's an interesting question, because I actually don't know. Because Wilder is so limited, technically. Like, he swings and throws himself off balance. He's not even thinking about going to the scorecards. He's trying to knock you out with the right hand. He's overcommitted to landing the right hand to knock you out. And I mentioned earlier how Valuev is very patient. He would sit there and he would wait, and he would just hold the center of the ring, and he would just throw a speculative jab, and he would look to break you down late. Is there a chance, and hear me out there, is there a chance that Valuev, as limited as he was and as slow as he was, might actually be able to break down and stop Deontay Wilder? Is there a chance that if the fight goes the distance, that Valuev might actually win the fight? Because one thing about Valuev that I think he had that Wilder doesn't have is a pretty good jab. Wilder, he just throws a speculative jab, and Valuev does that too, but Valuev, when he wanted to, actually did have a pretty stiff and pretty hard jab. And that jab, that left jab, with him being taller, could give Wilder a lot of problems, because Deontay Wilder, we've seen, is a sucker for that jab. When he fought Fury, he had no answer to it whatsoever. But even when he fought Johan Duhaupas, and Duhaupas is a shorter, more stocky pressure fighter who's nowhere near as big or as tough as Nikolai Valuev. And Duhaupas was able to bust Wilder up with a jab, and he was able to land the jab constantly. Even Stavern in the first fight landed a few jabs on Wilder. I keep thinking back to earlier in Wilder's career. Remember where he fought Dustin Nichols and he got dropped with the jab in that fight. And we all know about, if you look into Wilder's career, he was also knocked down, dropped by Harold Scornias, a journeyman who managed to drop him in one of the early rounds. And that really plays on my mind, because I think if those guys can drop Wilder, and if Duhaupas can bust him up with a jab, and if Fury can take away his power just by leaning back and parrying a shot away, it makes me think that Nikolai Valuev might actually beat Deontay Wilder. Nikolai Valuev might actually beat him if that fight were to happen. And I think it's a fascinating fight, man. Now, could Deontay Wilder win the fight on points? It's possible, because Valuev is much slower, very slow guy, but it's not a foregone conclusion in my opinion, because if Valuev was in a better mood, like if Valuev was there to fight, basically, like, put it this way, if it was Valuev when he fought Holyfield, for example, where he basically stood there and did nothing for 12 rounds and really should have lost that fight. Interestingly enough, Holyfield is another of the style of fighter that I was talking about. He's another guy who's small and cruiserweight sized. He was about 6'2", small, light on his feet. And he was past his prime, obviously, but still, the point still stands. He was a smaller, more athletic fighter, a lot more athletic than Wilder, and he was obviously employing a back foot game, using his lack of height and lack of size and his more fluidity and his cruiserweight speed and movement to his advantage. He used his inside fighting ability to his advantage. When he was getting inside on Valuev, he would just throw a couple of hooks, then move away, and never really let Valuev get himself set, never really let Valuev be comfortable in the ring. And I'm thinking to myself, I can't imagine Deontay Wilder doing that. That's the thing. I can't imagine Deontay Wilder fighting like Holyfield. I can't imagine Wilder fighting like David Haye. I can't imagine Wilder fighting like Ruslan Chagayev. I don't think he has the ability to make his lack of size count, especially when you consider how tall Wilder is, because the dude's 6'7" and very lanky and very gangly, very uncoordinated, very clumsy, and very emotionally erratic and very stupid, quite frankly. He's not an intelligent guy who is competent and can carry out a game plan. Valuev, at least to his credit, and I'm not saying Valuev was a great technical fighter, he wasn't. He was very pedestrian, upright, very limited, and very slow, and very methodical. But Valuev was an intelligent guy. The guy's not a complete buffoon like Wilder. He's not a guy who would go in there and swing and throw himself off balance. He was never knocked down in a fight. If he wasn't so intelligent, he would have been knocked down at some point, no matter how good his chin was. And his chin was very good. But I don't know, man. I think that Valuev might actually beat Deontay Wilder. I really do, because if this fight were to happen, I think Wilder would have success. I think he would maybe land the right hand once or twice early on. I think once he realised he can't hurt Valuev, he would start swinging. He would probably hurt his hand. He would probably back Valuev up a bit and then think he would have him in position for the knockout, but then find himself getting tied up and leaned on by such a big guy who's heavy and who hits harder than you might think because of his size and weight. And I think that Nikolai Valuev might actually beat Deontay Wilder. I think he might actually stop him, if I'm being honest. It's a fascinating fight, don't get me wrong, but I would go with Valuev. I think I'd go with Valuev by late knockout. I think he would do to Deontay Wilder what he did to Monty Barrett. I think he would give him success early on by taking some of those big shots, but then he would start to break him down. He would start to throw the jab, and he would conserve his energy, because that's what Valuev did. He would conserve his energy for the later rounds, and then since he'd conserved his energy, that energy that he'd conserved would then come into play later. Like, he would let his hands go and he would start to bust him up. That's what Valuev did in that fight. And there were other fights too, like against John Ruiz. That was more of an attritional fight too. Once again against a smaller guy who's more technical than he is. But I don't think that Deontay Wilder is anywhere near as technically skilled as somebody like even John Ruiz or like I said, Holyfield or Haye or Chagayev or Monty Barrett even. Like he's probably on a similar level technically to Monty Barrett, just a lot more athletic. But I don't think that Wilder would knock Valuev out, if I'm being honest. Valuev was never knocked out, and he took a lot of big shots. Okay, David Haye was a massive puncher, guys, and he wasn't able to knock Valuev out. Okay, so, it was only smaller guys like Haye and Chagayev and Holyfield and guys like that were able to beat Valuev. John Ruiz gave him a few problems too, but and Holyfield never got the decision, but I thought he won that fight. It was competitive, but I thought he won. But Valuev in all of those fights, even against Haye and Holyfield and Chagayev and all those others, he showed a tremendous chin. He was able to go the distance. He was able to use his size to make the fight somewhat competitive. So I think he'd beat Deontay Wilder. I think I'd go with Valuev by a late knockout. I think it's a great fight, man. I really do. So, am I crazy? Am I just losing the plot here? Would Valuev at his prime beat Deontay Wilder at his prime? Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and God bless. And stay tuned for more fantasy fights. I've got a few in mind and a few more coming. So let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and God bless.